I'm Fran Barelich, music curator at the Morgan, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. The idea for our collaboration on an exhibition with the Ricordi You want me to speak louder? Okay. The idea for our collaboration on an exhibition with the Ricordi Archive began some 5 years ago. And since that time, I've had the good fortune of working with these gentlemen in realizing the Verdi project. Just a reminder, the Verdi exhibition will be open for 45 minutes following the presentation. Please do pick up our calendar of events and music brochure where you will discover, among other things, a Verdi-inspired concert on October 20th. Pierluigi Ledda is Managing Director of the Ricordi Historical Archive in Milan. The archive contains not only scores and manuscripts of Italy's great composers, but also correspondence and the working documents of the Ricordi Publishing Company that was founded in 1808 by Giulio Ricordi's grandfather. The archive is digitizing its holdings to provide free access to its treasures. In addition to his work at the Ricordi Archive, Ledda is a lecturer in music management at the University of Udine and teaches publishing and music production at Milan's International University of Languages and Media. Over the years, he has organized conferences on sound archives and various musical events. Gabriele Dotto worked at Casa Ricordi of Milan for 18 years as editor-in-chief and later as director of publishing, a position that included responsibilities over the Ricordi Archive. At the University of Chicago Press, Dotto was the first managing editor of the critical edition of the works of Giuseppe Verdi. From 2004 to 2006, he was the administrative director of the National Institute of Verdi Studies in Parma, and since 2007 has been director of Michigan State University Press. He holds the editorial positions in connection with the critical editions of Donizetti and Puccini, as well as Bellini and that Italian composer Meyerbeer, and is currently preparing the critical edition of Falstaff. Dotto presently serves as Director of Scholarly Initiatives at the Ricordi Archive. So please welcome our guests, and I believe that Gabriele is going to start. So.
Am I audible? Is it on? Good. Buonasera. Thanks so much for coming out, so many of you as well. I hope you've all already had a chance to see the exhibit. It's such a pleasure to be able to inaugurate this, to see it at New York as well, because it traveled, a version of this, an earlier version, traveled to a number of cities in Europe. The concept of the exhibit is the following. Back in 2012, when the creative team of the Ricordi Historical Archive, the Archivio Storico Ricordi, began to consider ideas for an exhibit that would celebrate the bicentennial of Giuseppe Verdi's birth in 2013, we knew we wanted to do something different from the usual overview of life and works. In addition to that, we wanted to emphasize the particularly broad and multifaceted nature of the archive's holdings. The Ricordi Archive collection, or rather group of collections is the right way to put it, is distinguished by the fact that it houses not only enormous numbers of musical scores, opera librettos, theatrical artwork, music-related periodicals, and correspondence collected over more than 2 centuries of activity of the publishing firm, but also huge amounts of business correspondence and documents that reveal the entrepreneurial side of music publishing as it was in the 19th and the 20th centuries. We hit upon the idea of telling the story of two fascinating episodes from the latter part of Verdi's career. And in doing so, also telling in greater detail than anyone had done previously the fascinating background story of how this all developed. So, not only an artistic tale, which the story of the creation of Otello and Falstaff certainly is, but also a story of commercial acumen and entrepreneurial daring. As Zachary Wolfe recently observed in his New York Times review of this exhibit, the exhibit serves to remind us that, quote, music publishers in Verdi's day did not just print and mail scores. They also connected artists, advanced favored singers, created set, costume, and prop designs, compiled staging books that allowed opera houses to reproduce more or less moment by moment the blocking from the premiere, promoted openings, managed reputations, soothed egos. The company, in other words, was a one-stop operatic shop, crucial from beginning to the end of the process of composition and production. It is safe to say that Otello and Falstaff would not exist without Giulio Ricordi. You'll recall having seen this at the beginning of the mostra. This is a header from the graphic that puts into clear prominence the role of Giulio along with the two creators. But let's set the stage. Verdi. Giuseppe Verdi was a legendary figure even during his own lifetime. He was a true man of the theater with a powerful sense of writing captivating melodies and crafting scenes of effective dramatic impact. He was uncompromising about artistic integrity and demanded the utmost of his librettists and performers as well, an attitude that earned him the nickname the Bear of Busseto, Busseto being the small town outside of Parma where he was born. But this approach was always in the quest for the highest artistic achievement possible. Throughout his life, he remained an ambassador of Italian values and tradition both on stage and off. His career, which spanned more than half a century, culminated with two of his greatest masterpieces, the one we're focusing on, the last of which premiered when he was nearly 80 years old. The majority of his works still occupy a permanent part of the repertory, many of which, Rigoletto, La Traviata, Il Trovatore, Don Carlo, Aida, Otello, and Falstaff, are among the most performed of all operas, beloved by audiences the world over. Boito, brilliant, erudite, volatile, a superb man of the theater, Arrigo Boito was a poet, a translator, an essayist, an author of short stories, a composer. His avant-garde Mephistopheles remains a favorite in opera theaters worldwide. However, among lovers of Italian operas and specialists, he is perhaps best remembered as one of the finest craftsmen of librettos in opera history. His fine sense of dramatic pacing, word choice was enhanced by a sophisticated and nuanced mastery of the intricate interplay of verse structure. He was equally at home with the challenges of tragic expression and the delightful ironies of comedy. And he was the perfect partner for Verdi's last masterpieces. An interesting detail, however, which makes it somewhat curious how Ricordi thought he would pair these two. Boito, in his youth, was a radical iconoclast of the new art so-called scapigliatura movement. That translates to the disheveled ones. And he was an early champion of Wagner. Indeed, he had implicated Verdi among the targets of his youthful criticism against old-style music. But over time, he grew to venerate both the music and the singular moral integrity of Verdi, who in turn developed a close paternal rapport for the younger colleague. I love these two photographs. These come from, supposedly, the one on the left, so that's Verdi and Boito. The one on the left was supposed to have been taken, this is in the courtyard of Giulio Ricordi's home in Milano, via Borgonovo, where Verdi had been invited the summer before the creation of Falstaff, and surreptitiously took photographs. He hated to pose for photographs. He certainly did not like to have them. So they're actually, the reason Boito is caught off guard there is because there's a hidden camera behind a box or some bushes or something. Well, when then Verdi finds out, they finally put themselves in pose, and I love the way Boito immediately grabs his cigarette, a modern man, and strikes a pose. And Verdi does as well. Verdi strikes his typical pose of the, not so much the composer, but the well-to-do farmer in his old-style clothing. I love that look. Which brings us to Ricordi. Giulio Ricordi was the third in the line of a four-generation father-to-son dynasty that led Casa Ricordi for its first 110 years, from 1808 to 1919. He grew from being a scrappy, impetuous young man to become a veritable patron of the musical arts. He was himself a capable composer with a portfolio of charming compositions, most of which he signed under a pseudonym, Jules Brueggemann, and people have speculated for years about how he came up with that, but I'll leave that to other scholars to determine. He was also a perceptive music critic and an ingenious entrepreneur. He would become a legendary name in the annals of music publishing. He was a champion of new talents, of course, famous the story that he's the one who discovered and championed Puccini and many others. And he became so well known and influential that when he died in 1912, his obituary filled a complete column in the New York Times. So the next step, we have Giulio Ricordi, there on the left, Verdi adjusting his glasses. Here they're seated again at Ricordi's house, and Boito, this time either rolling another cigarette or checking his watch. We have the master diplomat who brings Boito and Verdi together. Verdi considered himself essentially retired from the theater after the premiere of Aida in 1871. Even though he did mull over an occasional new opera project after that, and he wrote, of course, the Requiem Mass in 1874, he never really started a new opera. At this point, he was wealthy and world famous. How wealthy? Well, according to the economic historian John Rosselli, quote, if Verdi had been able to collect all the royalties that were legally due to him, he would certainly have been, in modern terms, a billionaire. Now, that if is a key element. Verdi was certainly the beneficiary of a series of laws to protect intellectual property that had been enacted progressively starting in the mid-19th century. His publisher, Tito Ricordi, that's Giulio's father, was at the forefront of the battle to have all those laws enacted through much of Europe. Editorial piracy and the difficulty of enforcing such laws in all places and all occasions curtailed a considerable amount of what Verdi actually earned. But he was nonetheless certainly able to build great wealth in ways that his predecessors like Rossini and Donizetti could never have imagined. Verdi was, by the 1870s, a very wealthy man and looked forward to the calm life of a country gentleman at his large estate that he had purchased outside of his hometown in Parma, which he called Sant'Agata. Also, and this is important, Verdi very much felt the strain of attaining such success because it had been considerable for him. He actually became physically challenged writing many times. Many of his letters are filled with these terrible stomach complaints he has and stress. He found that the process of dealing with theaters and censors to be terribly exhausting, as well as the rigors of preparing performances, all frustrating. So, if he were to be convinced to write again, it would have to be on his own terms. Enter Giulio Ricordi. Although in the late 1870s and 1880s, Giulio's father Tito was still the head of the firm, Tito's relationship with Verdi had become somewhat strained, and Giulio became the main liaison with the maestro. Giulio venerated Verdi, the grand old man of Italian opera, and he hoped to get the chance to work directly with Verdi on a new project, just as his father and his grandfather had done. It would be Giulio Ricordi who single-handedly lured Verdi back to the stage. He was convinced that Verdi's retirement was a waste of genius. Therefore, he first contrived a tenuous reconciliation of Verdi with Arrigo Boito by proposing a collaborative revision of an earlier Verdi opera, Simon Boccanegra from 1857. It took some time to accomplish. A letter on display in the exhibit that you may have seen or will see from Verdi to Ricordi in 1879 reads, "I've received a large package which I assume contains the score to Simon Boccanegra. If you come visit me in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years, or 3, you will find the package still unopened. I told you I detest doing useless things. True, I've never done anything else in my life, but there were extenuating circumstances. There is nothing more useless than a new opera from me. Better to bow out with Aida and the Mass than adapting an old work." But in the end, the insistence of Giulio worked. Verdi undertook the revision, with Boito adapting the revised libretto. It proved highly successful, after which Ricordi resumed the pursuit of his original, meticulously planned project to get Verdi to consider an opera based on Shakespeare's Otello. This took a long, careful strategy of diplomacy on Ricordi's part. Months passed, years passed, punctuated by gestures of impish, if impatient, encouragement. The most famous of these gestures were the Milanese panettone that Ricordi would send to Verdi each Christmas, one of which was decorated with a figure of Othello, just as a gentle reminder. Verdi, however, continued to play his cards close to his chest. Nonetheless, Ricordi pressured Boito to send Verdi his draft of the Otello text before Verdi might lose interest in it. At one point, Verdi wrote to a functionary at Casa Ricordi, and I believe this letter is in the exhibit as well, "If I don't hand over the strangled Desdemona to Giulio this week, I'm afraid he will strangle me." Verdi gradually warmed to the appeal of Boito's elegantly crafted libretto. The inspiration took root, and their collaboration began in earnest. So here we have our trio of creative minds. A world-famous and fabulously successful opera composer with a stubborn reluctance to put pen to paper again after retiring. Another younger composer and respected man of letters who had recently worked with that very grand old man of Italian music to revise an earlier opera, and a skilled and perceptive entrepreneur who adroitly negotiated this collaboration in the profound conviction that it would produce something new and magnificent for the opera stage. The creative collaboration among this trio was very different talents would blossom into the enduring cultural legacy of Otello and Falstaff. So, how to reshape Shakespeare? Otello. The greatest challenge facing the librettist and the composer was to find the most effective way to transform a Shakespearean masterpiece that was conceived, of course, for spoken theater, with its different rules of dramatic timing and natural emphasis on dialogue, into theater in music, with its need for moments of synoptic narrative exposition, its musical rendition of emotion and motivation, and its numerous passages of suspended time in which characters stop and express their inner thoughts. You will, in the exhibit, hear a number of conversations. These audio portions that have been acted out by professional actors, we actually derive them from letters. Every single word that you hear is a translation of original texts that were exchanged between Verdi, Boito, and Ricordi, discussing various phases of composition, preparation, staging, etc. And we've assembled them as though these letters were actually narrated. Here's one of the observations from one of these conversations from Boito. An opera is not a play. Our art lives on elements unknown to spoken tragedy. 8 measures can suffice to revive a feeling. A rhythm can restore a character. Music is the most omnipotent of the arts. It has a logic all of its own, more rapid, more free than the logic of spoken thought, and far more eloquent. So for Otello, Boito respected the overall structure of Shakespeare's work, but he created a more complex role for Iago, as we'll see in a moment, and added scenes of intensified high drama. One particularly significant addition to the Shakespeare play is also one of the most striking moments in the entire opera, Iago's malevolent credo, a moment that greatly enriches the profile of the character. Here reproduced from the original libretto, just the opening lines, "Credo in un Dio crudel che m'ha creato simile a sé e che nell'ira io nomo, dalla viltà di un germe o di un atomo, vile son nato, son scellerato perché son uomo. I believe in a cruel God who created me in his image and whom in anger I name. From some vile seed or base Adam I was born. I am wicked because I am part of mankind. And then the terrible closing lines where he says, E credo l'uom gioco d'iniqua sorte, dal germe della culla al verme della vel, vien dopo tanta irrision la morte, e poi la morte è il nulla, e vecchia folla il ciel. And I believe man to be the sport of unjust fate, from the germ of the cradle to the worm of the grave. And after all this mockery comes death. And then, death is nothingness. Heaven is but an ancient fable. How this piece came to be added to the opera is a fascinating story all of itself. After Verdi had begun composing the first act in early 1884, a notorious and highly unfortunate incident brought everything to a halt. Boito, who was in Naples for a performance of his opera Mefistofele, was misquoted in a local newspaper as having supposedly said during a banquet that he regretted not having kept the libretto of Otello for himself to set to music. At first, Verdi believed this to be true and was deeply offended, offering to send the libretto back to Boito immediately. Ricordi and Boito were shocked. Boito had to use all the tact he could to explain the misunderstanding. Nonetheless, Verdi stopped working, and although he forgave Boito, he wrote, "All this has cast a chill over Otello and has stiffened the hand that had begun to write just a few bars of music. What will happen now? I cannot say." So soon after that, Boito sent Verdi a peace offering, this new credo, for Iago in Act 2, a piece, as I said, not found in Shakespeare. Verdi had told him earlier that he wanted something with complex verse structure that he could set to a very original musical patterns. Boito's new evil credo used, as he described it, a fascinating mix of broken, non-symmetrical lines. Verdi liked the new credo, which he found to be very powerful and completely Shakespearean, and soon the project was back on track. There's a wonderful performance of this, by the way, at the end of the exhibit in the videos that you'll see. The credo is included among these. There's one other detail that I find amusing. This isn't amusing, but I find amusing. Of one of the changes, it's a stage change, really, that Boito does with respect to Shakespeare. In Shakespeare, Desdemona is smothered with a pillow. In Boito, even though the clip that you'll see at the end here, the stage director decided to go back and use a pillow, but in Boito, very specifically, she is strangled. And one wonders, what is the point of that? And I'm just hypothesizing here, but think of an opera diva accepting in the most dramatic last scene she has on stage to have her face covered by a pillow? I don't think so. Well, it premiered, of course, on the 5th of February, 1887, to a run of sold-out performances. Otello was a huge success. Giulio Ricordi, as his father and grandfather had done, attended the premiere when it was in Milan, nervously annotating a libretto, and this is the closing pages, and we see these in the handwriting of Ricordi. This is also in the exhibit, where he writes, "One curtain call for everybody, a call for Verdi to come out by himself, frenetic applause. All the artists are called out on stage. The same for Verdi. Verdi called out on stage with Boito. Verdi, Boito, and the conductor, Faccio. Everyone out again, Verdi and Boito, and Verdi alone." It was a success. Following the triumph of Otello, Giulio Ricordi kept up his insistence and returned once again to the attack. By this time, in 1888, Giulio had succeeded his father as the general manager of the publishing firm. Despite Verdi's prudent reminder of just how far his restless genius might be able to carry him, he wrote at one point, "Have you considered the enormous number of my years?" Verdi would indeed create his culminating tribute to Shakespeare, the timeless comedy Falstaff. And it's interesting how Verdi has framed his career. His very first opera, which was a complete failure, was a comedy, a failure due largely in part because his wife and 2 children had died while he was composing it, so he was in no mood to write a comedy. It was also not the greatest of librettos, but then he ends this magnificent career, once again, with a comedy, but in the middle of all that, great amounts of tragedy. The shaping of the Falstaff libretto was in some ways even more imaginative than the work that Boito had done with Otello, since instead of using a single play, it was assembled from several Shakespearean sources into a spirited distillation with a prodigious wit all its own and a lively pace to match. Indeed, there is barely a moment of rest in Falstaff, and the conductor Toscanini always described it as quicksilver. Falstaff draws 3 plays. The basic plot follows that of the Merry Wives of Windsor, but the storyline is simplified and there are several changes. For example, Anne, known as Nanetta in Falstaff, is now the daughter of Mistress Ford, not Mistress Page, and she is betrothed by her father to Dr. Caius alone, with Mistress Ford and Page conspiring to aid in her elopement with Fenton. And several roles from the play were eliminated, as often happens in opera. Most importantly, the Merry Wives, the character of Falstaff is a rather two-dimensional comic foil. Boito chose to flesh out Falstaff's character by adding material from Shakespeare's Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. The most significant of these, of course, for those that know the opera, was the famous soliloquy about honor, found in Act 1, Scene 2 of Henry IV, Part 1. Boito also had great fun playing with meter, arcane vocabulary, since he knew that Shakespeare's plays had been based on a Florentine play from the 14th century. He returned to that source to recapture delightful and delightfully musical words that he used, for instance, in the 3rd act scene when the villagers are tormenting Falstaff. Words like cozzare, aiazzare, strozzare, ruzzare, vintuzzare, scorlare, punzacchiare. Completely unfindable words in most dictionaries, but all fine. And Boito, being Boito, that is to say, an absolutely brilliant mind and a lover of puzzles, also couldn't resist intricate games with a poetic structure like this one. This line, this section, is when Falstaff thinks he's able to seduce Alice, comes on after he's all prettied himself up and says, degna di un re, t'immagino fregiata del mio stemma. In other words, worthy of a king you are. I picture you adorned with my coat of arms. And Alice says, ogni bel gioiel mi nuoce, spregio il finto idolo d'or, mi basta un vel legato, in croce, un fregio, al cinto e in testa un fior. In other words, even the loveliest of jewels repulses me, and I despise the false idol of gold. A veil tied in a knot is enough for me, an ornament at my waist, and a flower on my head. But look at the games Boito plays with the verse structure, which also, of course, frees up Verdi to set it to music in very interesting ways. The first one, you can set it as an 11-syllable verse, followed by a 7. Ogni più bel gioiel mi nuoce e spregio, il finto idolo d'or, mi basta un vel legato in croce un fregio, al cinto in testa un fior. Spregio, fregio, d'or, fior. Or you can break it up into 9-syllable verses. Ogni più bel gioiel mi nuoce e spregio il finto idolo d'or, mi basta un vel legato in croce, un fregio al cinto e in testa un fior. Nuoce, croce, d'or, fior. Or you can break it up into 5 syllables. Ogni più bel gioiel mi nuoce e spregio il finto idolo d'or. Mi basta un vel legato in croce, in fregio, in cinto, in testa un fior. Bel, vel, nuoce, croce, finto, cinto, d'or, fior. There's a famous letter that once Boito wrote a little enigmatic canon that he sent to Verdi that could be read in several ways, and Verdi said nothing. And Boito then wrote, a little miffed, and he said, do you know how long it takes to come up with something like that? And Verdi said, that's why you shouldn't do it. Anyway, I have to say, looking at things like this, and Falstaff is filled with these wonderful little mind games that are meant for the cognoscenti, who will then go on and read the libretto and have a fun time with it themselves. I'd have to say that Boito would have been the sort of person, as the old joke goes, that would have done the Times crossword puzzle with a typewriter. Verdi also enjoyed filling the score to Falstaff with little musical puns, veiled musical quotes from other composers, even Wagner, and reminiscences from some of his other operas. The more I look at Falstaff, and I've been studying Falstaff since 1970, that kind of dates me, every time I look at it, and I think most composers that look at it, you always find something new in it, always. It's really one of the most tightly written operas. It's just a marvel. Enough, I digress. As with Otello, The correspondence between Verdi and Boito regarding Falstaff embraced everything from major issues of contextualization and structure to the tiniest details of word choice and staging. Much of this correspondence has survived, provides us with a fascinating window into the minds of these two incomparable artists as they wrestled with the creation of two timeless masterpieces of the opera repertory. Again, in one of those conversations that you'll hear in the audio bits of the exhibit, here's an exchange about how to end a comedy. Boito writes to Verdi, no doubt about it, the third act of Falstaff, they're still shaping and hammering out how the libretto will work. The third act is the coldest. And this in the theater means trouble. Unfortunately, there is a law common to all comic theater. Tragic theater has the opposite law. In comedy, when the knot is about to be unraveled, interest dwindles because the end is happy. There's a moment when the audience says, it's finished, and instead the stage business is not yet finished. Verdi responds, I am in perfect agreement as to the demands and the nature of tragedy and comedy. And the examples that you cite confirm what you say. But if in comedy there is a point when the audience says it is finished on the stage and it is not yet finished, then something must be found that can firmly fix their attention either on the comic side or on the musical side. For those of you that know Falstaff, their delightful solution to this problem was a master stroke, a full ensemble quasi-fugue with all the characters breaking the fourth wall, addressing the audience, a concept inspired by the Commedia dell'arte. Falstaff announces, let's end the scene with a chorus, and the cast intones the delightful message, everything in the world is but a jest, and all of us are mocked, but whoever laughs last, laughs best. The overall result of their collaboration was a brilliant work. As the critic David Carnes has observed, by replacing the fat butt of jokes of the merry wives with the philosopher knave of Henry IV, Boito gave Verdi the opportunity to create an authentically Shakespearean work such that an opera based on the merry wives alone would not have been. As for the music, Verdi created a wholly new and exciting sound world with Falstaff, with a pacing that left contemporary critics astounded. 70 years later, the composer Igor Stravinsky would say, I am struck by the force, especially in Falstaff, with which Verdi resisted or kept away from what had seized the advanced musical world. He's referring, of course, to Wagner. The presentation of musical monologues in Falstaff seems to me more original than in Otello. Original also are the instrumentation, the harmony, the part writing, yet none of these has left any element of a sort that would create a school. So different is Verdi's originality from that of Wagner. But even more remarkable than the gift itself is the strength with which he developed it from Rigoletto to Falstaff, to name the two operas I love best, end quote. Nonetheless, pardon me, as Verdi, Boito, and certainly Ricordi knew well, a brilliant and masterful score was not in and of itself enough to completely ensure success. And even if the new work was by Italy's most famous and revered composer. So, we come to designs and staging. And here's an interesting aside. One of the things that Ricordi could guarantee to Verdi had been told that both of these operas would premiere at the Teatro alla Scala. By the 1880s, the Teatro alla Scala, throughout most of the 19th century, the visual aspects of opera production, sets, costume, and staging, were the responsibility of contracted impresarios who commissioned operas and programmed the seasons. Later, this role was assumed by stable theater managers. In the case of La Scala in these years, throughout the 1880s, Casa Ricordi was the supervisory, let's say, team behind deciding the repertory of what would go on stage. In fact, in those years, not a single Wagner opera was produced until Ricordi bought the Wagner catalog from Lucca, and then suddenly they started doing Wagner. Then, for 2 years, Casa Sonzogno, his bitter rival, he of Cavalleria Rusticana and Sonzogno, took over. And then, again, in 1892 through 1894, Ricordi. So in each case, Ricordi could guarantee to Verdi that the production would be carefully prepared and overseen, because Casa Ricordi was, in effect, the impresario at Italy's most important theater. So for Otello and Falstaff, the publisher Ricordi did not intend to leave the supervision to others. The Ricordi firm itself had a staff of outstanding artists and designers in its famous graphic arts division, and Giulio used their talents to the fullest. Alfredo Edel was the designer of the costumes for Otello, and he was also a graphic artist working at Casa Ricordi. Giulio instructed him to study Venetian paintings of the late 15th and early 16th centuries in order to prepare some 60 historically accurate costumes for the principal roles of Otello, along with the accessories and the stage props. Several originals of these are in the exhibit, and you can see a slideshow of almost all of them. They were pursuing the goal of authenticity in those days in representation. And the publisher even went so far as authorizing the commissioning of custom-designed fabrics. There we have Iago on the left, we have Desdemona in the middle, and Otello on the right. And there are several versions of all their costumes. Really beautifully, beautifully studied and done. For Falstaff, Adolfo Hohenstein, who had recently become the artistic director in those years at Casa Ricordi. Hohenstein, for those of you who are also familiar with poster art, is very, very famous as one of the fathers of the Italian Art Nouveau movement known as Arte Floreale or Stile Liberty. For Falstaff, Ricordi sent Hohenstein to Windsor and to London to study the architecture of the days and to examine costume details of the Henry IV era at the British Museum. And here we have, up at the top, at the bottom, we have Ford, we have Alice, Falstaff, Dame Quickly. Now, to ensure the quality of subsequent productions, and here we have to go back into the mindset of the late 19th century. We're used to thinking about the way cinema is done these days, where a fixed performance never changes. In those days, it was not only important that the premiere go well, but a whole string of subsequent performances were also successful, or at very least well done, to ensure the ongoing and continuing success of a work. Ricordi prepared, here's a wonderful set painted by Hohenstein as well, always for Falstaff. Ricordi would prepare entire sets of black-line costume designs so that smaller theaters could, if they wanted, reproduce exactly the costumes that have been done at La Scala with detailed instructions for how to do everything from the wigs to the shoes, even to the type of stockings they wore, and how to build the costume exactly how it ought to be designed. And Ricordi, here he even appears as the author here, prepared, in this one for Otello, a series of production books. These, the so-called Disposizioni Sceniche, these were manuals that were inspired by the Paris opera Livret de Mise en Scène. They were often a record of the premiere production, as in this case with Otello, and were primarily intended as instructions to be able to replicate the staging at other theaters to ensure an opera's success as it traveled. While this one was authored by Giulio, and this is very interesting, all these bits that you see, often tied to actual music examples, they're the actual principal players, arrows to show in what direction they should be facing when they sang certain things, choruses, supernumeraries, how the movements should occur and in what case, and even details as to exactly what should happen when you sing certain things. Actually, stage directing even all of the movements. Here, tied when you sing this line, here, very softly, quickly to Desdemona, then loudly, as you did before, etc. Quite detailed. Even though Verdi often liked to protest that he knew nothing about such things, he would often send Ricordi letters that were very detailed, were things that he wanted to find. This one is also on display at the exhibit, where he mentions, "I'm simply envisioning for Falstaff a large garden with paths, bushes, plants grouped here and there, so that characters can hide and or appear as the drama and the music dictate." And these are all his little instructions, his drawings. There's a multiplicity of these letters in the Ricordi archive. Casting, of course, was of fundamental importance, and one of the conversations that you can hear in the exhibit involves discussion among the three men regarding the baritone Victor Marel, who created the role of both Iago in Otello and later Falstaff. And in those audio samples, you can also hear Marel singing Quand'ero Paggio del Duca di Norfolk from Falstaff from a remastered original recording of 1907 to get an idea also of his performance. Finally, but not least, marketing. It was important for the publisher to generate a very high level of interest in the premieres of the two operas, but maintaining that interest over the course of the first season performances and beyond was vital to the overall success of the entrepreneurial endeavor. You will also see or have seen the contracts that Verdi at that point in his career was able to command. We did the calculations going back to the original years and found that the advance on royalties guaranteed that Verdi was promised for Otello was in modern terms close to $1 million. Now, that doesn't make us blink when we think of the kind of money that some music generates today, but for classical music at the end of the 19th century, this was an astonishing investment on the part of the publisher, sorry. So it was very, very important for Giulio that this would all be a commercial success as well, and he was a master at this. Casa Ricordi worked on many levels. First and foremost, the carefully planned work of the publicist, both in Ricordi's own publications, the popular journal Musica e Musicisti, as well as in collaboration with newspapers and special editions of one of Italy's most popular periodicals, the Illustrazione Italiana. This was for high-end aficionados also. There were beautifully produced, limited luxury editions. A couple of these are on display from the Morgan collection in the exhibit. For a broader audience interested in collectibles, there were also merchandising items like postcards or souvenir photographs of the principal artists, some of which are also available. This was a two-page full-color spread in the Illustrazione Italiana piece for Othello. And here's the Falstaff piece, which was, this Casa Ricordi collaborated with a publisher in Milan to produce these collector's editions of the most popular periodical at the time, one for Othello and one for Falstaff. Articles describe Verdi and Falstaff, Verdi's librettists, Shakespeare's Falstaff character as discussed by literary critics, etc. There was also an essay by Giulio himself about how Verdi rehearses an opera, and there were specially commissioned photo essays, etc. One delightful essay suggested that Shakespeare's Falstaff character had in fact come from Italian literary roots, a 1368 tale from the Pecorone by Giovanni Fiorentino, a precursor of the Decameron. These beautifully designed issues intended to bring the public's interest to a fever pitch for the new operas, and what's very interesting in this, for people that are interested in this, the history of this sort of thing, these are very, very modern promotional techniques when you consider this is happening in the 1880s and 1890s. 30 years later or more, Hollywood would adopt these same kind of techniques, commissioning special playbooks that were based on films, obviously commissioning magazine essays and articles, etc. In 1880, for opera, this was a very, very new idea. And it struck a chord internationally as well. That earlier thing we had seen of the three men actually come from a outsized, folio-sized publication in London of the Graphic that shows a scene from Falstaff talking about this new premiere and setting up the interest there as well. International recognition for this kind of work, let me fast forward a little bit here. Ricordi, the firm Ricordi, became enormously famous for this, to the point that in the New York Times in 1911, there was a full-page article. This is just the very, very top of it. You can find it online. The music trust that reigns over Italian opera, the Ricordis of Milan, who control the Girl of the Golden West, this was after the premiere of La Fanciulla at the Metropolitan, have been factors in operatic history for 100 years. What's interesting in this article, you should take a look at it online, it goes on to talk about even our publishers here in America haven't caught on to how to do this yet. And it talks about French composers that their publishers haven't even showed up. Where are they? And just marveling at the commercial acumen of this Italian publishing firm. In all this activity, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the entrepreneur's role in the world of publishing is not only to use existing great talents in their catalog, but also to continually search out new talents on which to build the future fortunes of the firm. Giulio had many irons in the fire, not just Otello and Falstaff. And indeed, just 8 days before the premiere of Falstaff in Milan, another opera opened in Turin, just 88 miles away. Manon, of course, would prove to be the breakout opera that definitively launched Puccini's international career. So just days apart, Ricordi offered the crowning achievement of the end of the career of the grand old master and the new masterpiece of the rising young star. We might say that Giulio had a pretty good week. By the way, Giulio also collaborated actively in the creation of the operas. As many of you know, he's one of the people that shaped the final libretto of Manon Lescaut, and he worked very, very intensely and carefully on the libretto for Bohème. So, although Falstaff is brilliant theater and brilliant comedy, there's a strain of cynicism that veins its closing fugue, that apparently lighthearted tutto nel mondo è burla that I mentioned earlier. We're all indeed played for fools. As Verdi himself stated to Boito in one of the acted out conversations you can hear in this exhibit, thieving world, rascally world, evil world, Falstaff says, I know that, and alas, I knew it 30 years before you did. After Verdi's death, years later, when Toscanini was examining the autograph score in the Ricordi archive to Falstaff in order to prepare the famous revival performances at La Scala in the 1920s, the archivists found this slip of paper that Verdi had stuck in with the lines that Falstaff pronounces in Act 2, Va, vecchio John, va, va per la tua via. Go, old John, go, go along your way. It was Verdi's quiet way of saying, and this, finally, is the end of the career. But let's quote the words of Boito on the matter. He said that Falstaff is more than a brilliantly amusing opera. It is a source of intellectual joy, of vindication of the world, and of humanity's incorrigible optimism in the face of every possible discouragement. Fran Barulik added a lovely letter at the end of the exhibit that Verdi had written to Emma Zilli, silk-screened on the wall, you'll find it, in which he recalled the melancholy of when we rehearsed Falstaff first in my home and later in the Ridotto alla Scala. Here's a lovely watercolor by Hohenstein of Verdi at rehearsals at La Scala, the so-called prove all'italiana in front of a piano. What it meant is that for him, the final performances of Falstaff signaled that now, finally, his career as a composer for the stage was concluded. So we've talked about several logistical and practical aspects of what helped ensure the success of these operas, but of course we mustn't lose sight of one fundamental fact: these were miraculous artistic creations. The dramatic pacing is superb, and in these late works, Verdi showed a masterful command of orchestral shading and effect, from the tremendous power of the Tempest scene and the nuanced touches of the ensembles in Otello to the scintillating and brilliant orchestral color of Falstaff. I love this image here. This is on the roof. Many of you will know that Verdi left as his legacy. His children had died, of course, very, very young. He left his worldly goods and his future royalties to build an old folks' home in Milan for retired musicians who had been left indigent, the Casa di Riposo dei Musicisti. Arrigo Boito's brother, Camillo Boito, was the architect. This is Boito on the left and Ricordi on the right, looking out over a piazza in Milan. We're sort of bidding them adieu with this letter as they're looking out over the work as it progresses on the Casa di Riposo. Now, of course, there's much more to see and experience in this exhibit than the brief overview that I've offered here. Don't let this apparently compact dimensions of the show fool you. In its 7 main sections as they've been laid out: commissioning, creating, contracting, designing, casting, staging, publicizing, and publishing, there's a wealth of extra information as well as extra media beyond the precious original artifacts that are on display. Fran Barulik and her collaborators have done an absolutely wonderful job creating a very elegant and indeed a striking layout of this exhibition. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening.
Buonasera, good evening. Can you hear me? Yes. So, this is a nice quote from Roger Parker about the scale of Ricordi in the 19th century. And let's start from this building. It's the building of Teatro La Scala. And this is where the Ricordi business started with Giovanni Ricordi, the grandfather of Giulio Ricordi. And the company was here, but today you find the Scala Museum and the restaurant. You can see Giovanni, and they had a very unique career in the field of music publisher, because Giovanni started as a copyist, then went to Germany to learn the printing methods and imported some machines from Leipzig, and established the publishing business in 1808. Then in 50 years, it became something more than a publisher. It became the producer, the impresario, handling all the complexity of the staging of these operas, so not only a publisher. And all this is in the Archivio today. So this is why the collection is so peculiar and unique. This is the Milan, a map of Milan in the 19th century. It's smaller than today, obviously. And the core of this was the Teatro La Scala. And Ricordi is known for melodrama, for big opera composers. He was the publisher of the Fantastic Five, you see in this picture. Oh, sorry. So Bellini, Verdi, Donizetti, Puccini, Rossini, and many others. And we have some pictures of the production shops at the times of Verdi, the music stores of Ricordi in Italy, Naples, London, so abroad, New York. Maybe somebody knows which street this is. So you have to imagine a very complex, diversified music industry representing artists and handling their careers internationally in a pre-internet, pre-phone era. And all this artistic power needed a machine, an organizational machine, to exist. And we find these traces in the archive. Gabriele mentioned the big investment made by Ricordi on the last Verdi's operas, like Otello. And in this book, Ricordi summarized the main conditions of the contracts with the composers. So basically, each line is an opera. And in the top line, you can see Otello. So if we zoom on Otello, you see the 200,000 liras. This is the minimum fee given by the publisher to Verdi, which is approximately 1 million euros of today. So it's a very important investment. Plus, and this is the crucial part from the entrepreneurial perspective, plus the royalties. So the 40% on the rentals of the opera to the theaters, plus the 50% of sales of printed editions. And Ricordi introduced this system in Italy, which is the beginning of the modern music industry, is the copyright system. Before this, the relationship was not between the publisher and the composer, but was between the theatrical impresario and the composer. So it's changes the system. And if you compare this fee with a contemporary composer of Verdi, Marenco, you can see how different is the fee. So a very tough system. And Verdi at the time, he was at the peak of his career. He had a huge contractual power, and he was conscious of this. So he was a very tough negotiator with the publisher. And this is a quote from a letter of Giuseppe Verdi to Giulio. You can understand how demanding, how tough was Verdi. It makes me laugh when I read or hear an effect that the author had not imagined. Poor innocence. For those who do not know either singing or orchestra, it might be. But for me, I have never found a singer or orchestra that has done everything I asked for. So for Giulio, for the young Giulio Ricordi, it was not easy to handle this guy. And you can see this wonderful picture of Verdi in his villa in Sant'Agata, together with Giulio Ricordi, with Hohenstein, the lawyer, in a very royal mood. He was, Verdi in a way was the reason, the factor who brought Ricordi on the international stage. The big expansion of the publisher was driven by Giuseppe Verdi. And then Giulio Ricordi was clever enough and sensitive enough to find the new Verdi, because the problem for the publisher was the continuity and find the new big composer. And Giulio invested on Giacomo Puccini despite his first not successful operas, against the board of the company. The constant is that all the Ricordi managers from the Ricordi family had music skills. They can recognize good composers, good music. And a very quick overview of other documents in our collection. I will try to bring you in Milan, in our vaults, the autograph scores of Puccini. And this is Bohème, and Puccini sketches a skull when the character of Mimi dies. And often you also find notes, directing notes. So the composers are also directors. So many layers of information in the same documents. The Capricci from Niccolò Paganini, contemporary scores like the visual scores from Silvano Bussotti, Rara Gramma. This is also the key, the symbol even image of our archive, because you archive Ricordi. So again, Silvano Bussotti, Salvatore Sciarrino, he uses to write music graphically. So this is a diagram which is like the condensation of the full score of the music. And of course, graphic art, the posters, and Turandot, the records. This is the first record produced by Ricordi in 1958. Maria Callas singing Medea at the Teatro La Scala. And this was the beginning of the label Ricordi, which then became the label of Italian pop singers like Battisti, De André, and the graphic, the cover arts were realized by Bruno Munari or Crepax, so they are very beautiful. What is this? This is a milestone for us. This is a document of 1994 from the Minister of Culture in Italy, which declares that this set of documents is not just the archive of a company, but is national cultural heritage. So for the archive, this means a real change of nature, of activities, and this is the starting point of what we do today and what we are today. The Archivio Storico Ricordi, a cultural entity in Italy which is promoting this collection in many different ways. And we are part of Bertelsmann, the German media group, and we are one of the cultural projects inside the Bertelsmann field, and they are giving an important contribution in preserving the archive. Today we are in the Brera building in Milan. The Brera building houses the Pinacoteca di Brera, the Academy of Arts, the Biblioteca Nazionale Braidense. We are hosted by the library, Braidense Library. This is the Maria Teresa Hall, where we do concerts and conferences. And of course, the deposit vaults of the Archivio, where the documents sleep, with the exception of the exhibitions, like the one we are bringing here. And you can see some highlights from this collection. And of course, a big part of the project is about preserving the collection, which means not only storing, but means also copying, digitizing this collection to make it available. This is interesting. These are the press clips of the time. So we also know the reactions of press and audiences to the various operas. So it's so rich. Production cards, you can see this in the exhibition. So you know how much that opera was produced through librettos and printed edition. And of course, I mentioned the restoration and the digitization. The restoration is interesting because sometimes, is the case of Giacomo Puccini, it brings new content about the document. In this case, you can see here, this window, Puccini used to stick stripes of new music paper on the autograph score with these corrections. So with the restoration, we were able to unstick this and see the previous, the original version. And this, for musicologists and scholars, is very important. And the documents, like the full scores of Bohème, for example, Un bel dì vedremo, thanks to digitization, we can map them and synchronize them with music. In the exhibition, you will find an example of this. So you can listen and follow the music of Falstaff, of Tutto nel mondo burla, synchronized with the score, with different interpretations. So it's a way to complete the document, because the document is mute without the execution of the music. And of course, our portal, the Collezione Digitale, is the digital resource to access the archive. So we are gradually digitizing the collections and make these collections available. And you can already find the whole iconographic collection with the designs of costumes, sets, props, and the letters, sometimes with transcriptions of the content, translation, and we are also inviting users and scholars to provide the missing contents, the missing translations and transcriptions. So it's a dynamic system, very flexible, which is gradually completing the mosaic of Ricordi. And there is a book. This book is called Cathedral of Music. It's a general, is the way to access the archive. So you can see the raragramma from Silvano Bussotti. We are using obsessively this image. And I suggest this as a first step into the collection. And it's also about reusing our heritage. We find creative ways to revive the documents through projects. And one example is the collaboration we did in 2015 with the Teatro dell'Opera di Roma. They wanted to stage the original staging of Tosca, of Puccini's Tosca. So we collaborated. So what you can see the original set design reproduced for a new staging, and as well as the costumes. Some cases, same thing we did here in New York with New York City Opera 1 year afterwards. Concerts in Brera, but also, for example, in Berlin, reviving the repertoire. Reprints, we are trying to highlight some interesting records produced by Dischi Ricordi, like this Luigi Nono, Non consumiamo Marx, a very political, avant-garde electronic record from the late 60s. Special concerts, giving the records to contemporary artists and let them use these records as to shape them and creating something new, and also fashion shows. As a collaboration we did 3 years ago in Milan with Dolce & Gabbana, and they were using some signs of the Archivio to create new clothes. And of course, this is not my costume when I go to theater. I would like to, but the message here is that the archive is available to the creatives of today to generate new signs, new contents, and we really encourage this on many levels, not only with big fashion companies, but also with the students of fashion design, costume and set design. They come to our offices, they study the documents, and they make laboratories, so on many different levels. And finally, Milano, because the Ricordi is a very Milanese company, and everything started in La Scala. And today, if you go to La Scala Square, on the left, you find the statue of Giulio Ricordi, which has been taken from the dismissed premises of Ricordi, restored, and placed on front of his original office. You can see the major, you can see the grandson, cousin of Claudio Ricordi, you can see me, very proud. But now today we have tourists going to visit this statue, and also very special tourists like our Gabriele Dotto. And finally, a project which I'm very proud of is the Verdi exhibition. We did this in 2015. The concept was curated by Gabriele Dotto and called The Enterprise of Opera. The meaning was precisely this big machine which was necessary to produce these masterpieces. And today we're really proud that this concept met the Morgan Library and was enriched by the collection of the Morgan Library and brought here to New York in this very special place for you. And I hope you will enjoy the exhibition, and I hope that you will investigate more about our collection. It's difficult to condensate all this complexity, all this richness in this time, but I hope I try to. Thank you very much.